Picture a country where 1 in 4 young men hasn't been touched by another person in over a year. No kiss, no date, nothing. That country is yours. In the early 2010s, about 9% of American men in their 20s and early 30s said they had no sex in the past year. By 2022, that number had nearly tripled, 24%, 1 in 4. Women climbed too, from 8% to 13%. Still rising. The share of Americans having sex at least once a week collapsed. 55% in 1990, 37% in 2024, an 18-point drop. But this goes far deeper than the bedroom. Americans used to spend over 6 hours a week with friends. Now the average person gets 35 minutes a day of face-to-face socializing. Teenagers who used to hang out for over 2 hours a day after school are down to 40 minutes. The rest of that time swallowed by screens. 9 hours of screen time every single day. 79% of Gen Z says they feel lonely. The average person now says they have 2 close friends. It used to be 5. 1 in 6 men says he has none. South Korea just posted a fertility rate of 0.75, the lowest any nation has ever recorded in human history. In Japan, over half of men in their 20s are virgins. China saw more marriages disappear in a single year than some countries have people. And the part nobody wants to talk about? Young men and young women are no longer just drifting apart romantically. They're splitting apart ideologically. The gender gap in the 2024 election was 31 points. Young men swung to the right, young women went further left. They're consuming different media, adopting different values, and building separate realities. And neither side has much interest in crossing over. This is a story about loneliness, screens, economics, politics, dating apps, cancel culture, the death of the cold approach, and the quiet vanishing of an entire generation's intimate life. This is why Gen Z isn't having sex. Alright, before we get into opinions, ideology, or blame, let's lay out what we actually know. Because we know a lot. The federal government has been tracking Americans' sexual behavior for decades through some of the most respected surveys in social science. The National Survey of Family Growth, run by the CDC, is one of the gold standard data sets. And the numbers from its 2022 and 2023 wave hit like a truck. Among Americans aged 22 to 34, 24% of men reported zero sex in the past year. That's up from just 9% roughly 10 years earlier. Not a gentle slope, a cliff. For women in the same age bracket, it went from 8 to 13%. Not as sharp, but still a 50% jump in a decade. Male virginity doubled overnight. 10% of men in that age range said they had never had sex. The Institute for Family Studies put it plainly. Sexlessness among young men had roughly doubled across every measure. For women, it's up about 50%. And this isn't just one rogue data set. The 2024 General Social Survey backed it up. About 25% of men aged 18 to 29 no sex in the past year. For women, 18.5%. The Kinsey Institute, one of the most recognized names in sex research, found that 1 in 4 Gen Z adults had never had partnered sex at all. For young men, it was 1 in 3. The trend didn't just materialize at age 21. The roots go back to adolescence. In 2000, 80% of high school seniors had gone on a date that year. By 2023, 45%, cut nearly in half. Only 56% of Gen Z adults say they had any romantic relationship during their teen years. Compare that to 78% of boomers, 76% of Gen X. 45% of Gen Z men had zero relationship experience as teenagers. That's double the rate of older generations. The CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey shows that only 32% of high school students in 2023 had ever had sexual intercourse. In 2021, that number was 54%. So we're not just staring at a blip. This is a generational shift, one that started in the teenage years and accelerated into adulthood. Now, here's where the story goes from young people aren't hooking up to something much bigger. because the decline in sex doesn't exist in a vacuum. It sits on top of a collapse in friendship, socializing, and basic human contact. The Atlantic's Derek Thompson coined a term for it, the antisocial century, and the numbers back him up. Americans historically spent 6.5 hours a week with friends. Between 2014 and 2019, before COVID, that dropped to 4. By 2024, the average American was getting 35 minutes of in-person social time per day, down from 42 a decade earlier. Young people got hit the hardest. 15 to 25-year-olds are spending 26 fewer minutes per day socializing in person than they did in 2003. That adds up to 13 hours a month that just evaporated. Teenagers now spend about 40 minutes a day with friends outside of school. That used to be 140 minutes. Meanwhile, the average teen racks up nearly 9 hours of screen time daily. The downstream effects are brutal. 79% of Gen Z reports feeling lonely, the worst of any generation. The average person now says they have 2 close friends. A few decades back, it was 5. And 15% of men say they don't have a single close friend. That number has multiplied by 5 since 1990. 27% of Gen Z adults have no close friends outside of family. 43% have none at work. The U.S. Surgeon General declared a national loneliness epidemic. His specific comparison, the health damage from chronic isolation is on par with smoking 15 cigarettes a day, elevated risk of anxiety, depression, heart disease, stroke, and premature death. There's a concept in sociology called third places, not home, not work. The coffee shop, the park, the mall, the bar, the community center, the places where you'd bump into someone, strike up a conversation, maybe meet somebody. Robert Putnam documented the decline years ago. By 2000, Americans were 58% less likely to attend a club meeting and 45% less likely to have friends over than they were 25 years earlier. COVID wiped out even more of what was left. For young people, unstructured time has been slashed. Helicopter parenting, overscheduled childhoods, and the share of adults 25 to 34 living with their parents doubled from 9% in 2000 to 18% in 2023. Privacy for romance? Good luck. And here's the painful irony. 58% of Gen Z says they'd prefer to meet a romantic partner in person. They want organic connections. They just don't have the places, the time, or for many of them, the social skills to make it happen. Nearly every dataset converges on the same inflection point, somewhere between 2010 and 2015. That's when smartphones became basically universal among teenagers. Jonathan Haidt calls it the Great Rewiring. Gene Twenge analyzed surveys covering over 11 million young people and found that teens in the 2010s spent a full hour less per day on face-to-face socializing than teens in the 80s, even though they actually had more free time. Gen Z now averages over 6 hours a day on their phones. Nearly 70% say they're addicted, and the displacement is measurable. The Institute for Family Studies found that weekly in-person social time among young adults roughly halved, from close to 13 hours in 2010 to about 5 by 2024, and that drop started well before COVID. Here's the one thing that might freak you out. According to the American Time Use Survey, the typical female pet owner now spends more time with her pet than in face-to-face contact with her friends. Let that sit for a second. Between 80 and 90% of young adults report having been exposed to pornography. The average first exposure? Somewhere between ages 10 and 13. Among men under 30, about 17% use it daily, 2.5 times the rate of older men. Heavy use has been linked to lower rate of sexual satisfaction, weaker commitment in relationships, and for roughly 45% of heavy male users, erectile dysfunction. But there's one important wrinkle. The casual direction is debated, and one finding really complicates the narrative that porn alone is driving this. Gay men haven't seen comparable declines in sexual activity, even though they consume porn and play video games at a similar or higher rates. So whatever's happening, it's not as simple as screens replaced sex. Dating apps were supposed to democratize romance, expand your options, make it easier. Instead, they have made things worse. 79% of college students don't use dating apps at all. In 2024, 65% of downloaded dating apps were deleted within a month. By 2025, that hit 69%. Tinder lost roughly 600,000 users in the United Kingdom alone. Bumble's stock has shed 90% of its values since its 2021 IPO. 21% of Gen Z says apps are their main way of meeting people. More than half report feeling burned out from them. The ghosting, the performative bios, the transactional swipe right, swipe left grind. And the real kicker, 82% of Americans still meet their partners in person. Even among Gen Z, only about 1 in 4 meet their match digitally. Dating apps dominated the cultural narrative about how people connect without actually dominating the reality. But what dating apps did do, and this is well documented, is inject extreme inequality into the dating market. A Hinge engineer published internal analytics showing that the Gini coefficient for males' likes on the platform was 0.54. That is a standard measure of inequality, and that number is comparable to income inequality in sub-Saharan Africa. For women, it was 0.38, closer to Western Europe. Translation, the top 10% of men were receiving 58% of all female likes. The bottom half of men were splitting just 4%. On Tinder, men swipe right about 46% of the time, women 14%. Men average 0.6 matches per day on Hinge, women average 5. This subject matter can be hard to digest, but for most Americans, their personal financial situation is the hardest subject to approach and manage, but with the Dollarwise budgeting app, you can finally take control, and since there's a free trial, you can see for yourself, get a full picture, automate your budget, get powerful insights, and set real goals that change your life. Download Dollarwise or go to dollarwise.com. Pew found 64% of men who tried online dating felt insecure from the lack of responses. 54% of women felt overwhelmed by too many. So one side of the market is starving and the other side is drowning, and both walked away frustrated. If you've spent any time in the corners of the internet where young men discuss dating, you've heard the phrase, the 80-20 rule. The idea that 80% of women are only interested in the top 20% of men. So let's unpack this. The claim didn't come from any peer-reviewed study. It traces back to a 2015 blog post on Medium by an anonymous user who ran a rough statistical analysis on Tinder data. The author himself admitted flaws in his methodology. The related talking point cites OkCupid's 2009 internal data, which showed that women rated 80% of male profiles as below average in attractiveness. That sounds devastating until you look deeper. Those same women still messaged the men they'd rated poorly. Meanwhile, men funneled almost all their messages to the most attractive women. A 2025 study of 4,500 speed dates found that face-to-face is the gender selectivity gap, the gender selectivity gap is far smaller than on apps. Men said yes about half the time, women about a third. That's a 1.5 times difference, not the 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio that you see on swiping platforms. And here's the finding that directly challenges the narrative that a handful of attractive men are hoarding all the women. The Institute for Family Studies analyzed federal data and found no increase in the number of men with lots of female partners. The spike in male sexlessness was driven entirely by fewer men in monogamous relationships, not by some kind of top-tier guy harem effect. The main driver is declining marriage, not a winner-take-all mating market. So the honest assessment, the 80-20 rule is a massive oversimplification. It reflects something real about how dating apps concentrate attention, but it is not evidence that 80% of men are invisible to women in the real world. Studies consistently show that people end up with partners of roughly similar attractiveness. Researchers call this assortative mating. But, and this is the part that matters, the perception has become its own force. When young men believe that the system is rigged, many of them just quit. And when they quit, they go looking for explanations. And some of those explanations lead to very dark corners of the internet. We need to talk about what might be the most underreported factor in this entire story: the political and ideological rift between young men and young women. The 2024 election produced a 31-point gender gap among young voters. Young women favored Kamala Harris by 17 points. Young men favored Donald Trump by 14. Among young white men, Trump won by 28. Gallup data shows that young men have been drifting away from the Democratic Party since about 2008. Among young men, Democratic identification fell from 51% in 2016 to 38% by 2023. For the first time in more than a decade, more young men call themselves Republicans than Democrats. Young women moved the opposite direction. About 65% voted for Democrat in both 2020 and 2024. Now, some important nuance. Gallup's own researchers say that the gap is mostly driven by women becoming more liberal faster, not by some mass male migration to the far right. Polarity of young men still identify as moderate, but the cultural realignment is real, and the 2024 election deepened it. The divide runs well beyond the ballot box. 61% of Gen Z women call themselves feminist. 43% of Gen Z men do. 45% of young men approve of Trump's handling of immigration. Only 21% of young women do. A global study spanning 30 countries found that 57% of Gen Z men believe that women's rights promotion now actively discriminates against men, and this bleeds directly into dating. A 2021 poll found that 71% of Democratic college students wouldn't date someone who voted for the other side. Over 60% in a separate survey said differing political views were a deal breaker. Women are significantly more rigid on this. 26% of single women consider political compatibility non-negotiable, compared to 14% of men. Stanford researcher Alice Evans summed it up: Gen Z is 2 generations, not 1. The mechanism isn't mysterious. Social media algorithms feed men and women completely separate information ecosystems. Young men are significantly more likely to get their news from YouTube, where recommendation algorithms can funnel viewers towards manosphere content. Young women consume content that reinforces progressive frameworks. They're building worldviews in parallel that barely overlap, and they're supposed to sit across from each other at dinner and find common ground. It's not working. Imagine this. It's 2004, you're at a bar. You spot someone across the room. You walk up, you say something. Maybe it's smooth, probably it isn't. But either way, it's a private moment between 2 people. Nobody recorded it, nobody posted it. Nobody got their life ruined for taking a shot. Fast forward to today, Gen Z is the first generation to go through puberty and young adulthood entirely under the microscope. Every awkward encounter, every rejected pickup line, every cringy DM can be screenshotted, posted, shared, mocked, and archived forever. Cancel culture started as a tool for holding powerful people accountable. Whatever your opinion on it, it has also created a chilling effect on regular social behavior. For young men, the math has changed. An awkward or unwanted approach, even a well-intentioned one, could turn into online humiliation, social exile, or worse. A lot of guys decided the risk just isn't worth it, so they stopped approaching entirely. On the other hand, social media has put the threat of harassment, manipulation, and violence front and center in the Gen Z female experience. The fear is not irrational. It is grounded in real stories that circulate constantly. But the result is that many young women now default to interpreting male interest through a lens of potential danger, which makes the opening act of romance, the approach, the spark, the first awkward conversation, feel loaded with risk from both directions. What replaced the cold approach is something called the talking stage. 2 people message each other every day for weeks, sometimes months. They share memes, they exchange surface level details, but nobody commits. Nobody puts a label on it. Sometimes they never even meet in person. It is a simulation of intimacy without any of the actual vulnerability. For a generation terrified of rejection and public judgment, it makes sense. It's also deeply unsatisfying. The hard evidence linking cancel culture directly to sex rage is admittedly thin. We know that many male managers report feeling more uncomfortable interacting one-on-one with women since Me Too. We know that social punishment is a powerful deterrent. Whether that directly explains falling sex rates for an entire generation? Honest answer, it's a real contributing factor, but it is hard to isolate. But what is undeniable is the effect on spontaneity. Romance has always required risk. The willingness to be awkward, to be rejected, to be vulnerable. When the downside of rejection goes from a private embarrassment to a public spectacle, a lot of people decide the juice isn't worth the squeeze.
Imagine what you would look like. Imagine what you can't. Imagine it is exceptionally hard. And life is hard. Go through the hardship it takes a man of value.
When young men face repeated rejection, crushing loneliness, and a sense that society doesn't particularly care about their problems, a subset of them inevitably find communities online that offer an explanation. The manosphere is a loosely connected online ecosystem that includes men rights activists, pickup artists, the red pill community, men going their own way, and its most extreme fringe, incels. Academic research tracking nearly 29 million posts found a clear evolution. The movement shifted from moderate communities in the late 2000s to significantly more extreme, toxic, and misogynistic spaces by 2016 to 2018. Andrew Tate became the most visible face of this world. His videos racked up billions of views. UK polling found that 32% of young men aged 16 to 2025 hold a positive view of Tate. But here's the interesting part. 58% of those same fans simultaneously describe him as sexist, and 56% call him a misogynist. They're not blind to what he's doing. They're drawn to the success and motivation messaging, not necessarily the views on women. A study of over 1,100 people found that only 7% reported real-world behavioral influence from Tate. The researchers conclude the functions less as a catalyst and more as a mirror, reflecting broader frustrations that already exist. Mainstream coverage tends to paint incels as a homogeneous group of young, white, far-right extremists. The data tells a different story. The most comprehensive study to date out of Swansea University and UT Austin, with backing from the UK's Commission for Countering Extremism, surveyed 561 self-identified incels and found a population that defies the stereotypes. 42% were people of color. The average age was 26. Their political views averaged slightly left of center, not far right. More than half were employed or in school full-time. What defined this group wasn't ideology, it was pain. 86% of them had been severely bullied. 30% met clinical threshold for an autism spectrum referral, compared to 1% in the general population. 48% scored the maximum level of severe loneliness on every measure, and 37% reported having suicidal thoughts every single day. The researchers identified two distinct pathways into incel identification, one driven by genuine psychological crisis and loneliness, and another driven by ideological grievance and hostility towards women. Those are very different populations with very different needs, but they share the same label and the same forums. 1 in 5 Gen Z adults, both men and women, describe themselves as involuntarily celibate. The radicalized online identity is overwhelmingly male, but the experience of wanting connection and not finding it, that crosses gender lines. There's a version of this conversation that treats the sex decline as purely cultural, but the economic pressures are enormous, and ignoring them means missing half the story. Take a moment and get some free, easy money. With a Chime checking account and my link, you can get $350 when you set up direct deposit, and pair that with a nation-leading high-yield savings rate. There's literally no reason not to sign up right now. Chime.com/Caleb, or link in the description below. American student loan debt now sits somewhere around $1.8 trillion, spread across 42 million borrowers. That's more than tripled since 2007. Research published in a major demographics journal found that every additional $1,000 of student debt reduces the odds of a first marriage by 2% per month. A Gallup survey found 29% of borrowers delayed buying a home, 15% delayed having children, and 13% delayed marriage, all because of debt. Housing compounds the problem. Census research confirmed that high housing costs and living with parents are associated with lower marriage rates among young adults. A survey found that Gen Z spends an average of $194 per date across about 14 dates a year. That's nearly $2,700 annually. And about 74% say dating has gotten too expensive. The milestone delay is dramatic. In 1975, almost 50% of 25 to 34-year-olds had checked all 4 traditional boxes: moved out, got a job, got married, had kids. By 2024, fewer than 25% had. The median age at first marriage hit all-time highs: 30.5 for men, nearly 29 for women. In 1960, those numbers were 23 and 20. It's a vicious cycle. Financial stress kills dating activity. Being single means smaller households. Smaller households mean higher per-person housing costs. Higher costs delay independence. Delayed independence prevents relationships from forming. Around and around. There's a structural dimension here too, and it's uncomfortable but real. Women now earn roughly 58% of bachelor degrees and 61% of master's degrees. That's a massive win for gender equality, but it's also created a numbers mismatch. Because women tend to prefer partners who are at least at their socioeconomic level, a pattern researchers call hypergamy, the small pool of highly educated, financially successful men suddenly has enormous leverage. Those men can get attention and access without offering commitment. The result, a growing share of women feeling frustrated by a dating landscape of non-committal situationships, and a large majority of average men feeling invisible and locked out entirely. Federal Reserve economists found that the rise of online dating contributed to a 33 percentage point increase in household income inequality, because high earners are increasingly matching with other high earners while everyone else gets left behind. What's happening in America is not just American. This is a developed world phenomenon, and the most extreme examples should scare everyone watching. South Korea's fertility rate of 0.75 is the lowest ever recorded by any country. It was 6 in 1960. It was 1.12 just a decade ago. Now it's below replacement by a factor of 3. The country is in a genuine gender war. Organized feminist movements like the 4B movement, women boycotting marriage, motherhood, dating, and sex with men battle against virulent anti-feminist backlash online. The previous president blamed feminism for the birth crisis and slashed funding for domestic violence programs. South Korea has poured over $270 billion into pro-natalist policies since 2006. The needle has barely moved. The Bank of Korea now projects the low birth rate could push the country into permanent economic recession by the 2040s. Japan's crisis is older and just as severe. Over half of men in their 20s are virgins. Japan coined the term herbivore men back in 2006 for young guys who simply aren't interested in pursuing sex or relationships. Between 500,000 and 1 million Japanese are classified hikikomori, social recluse who refuse to leave their homes. Married sexlessness hit 64% in 2024, the highest ever recorded. And here's a detail that matters: the collapse of arranged marriages, which fell from 63% of all unions in 1955 to just 7% by 1998. Removed the traditional infrastructure through which most Japanese formed families. Nothing replaced it. Japanese population of 124 million could fall to 87 million by 2070, and under 45 million by 2105 at current rates. China may be facing the most consequential demographic crisis of all. Only 6.1 million couples married in 2024. That's a nearly 20% drop from the year before and a 55% collapse from the 2013 peak. The lying flat movement, young Chinese rejecting the relentless grind of work and consumption, including marriage and kids, went viral in 2021. Housing in Shanghai and Shenzhen runs 25 to 45 times average annual income. Youth unemployment officially peaked at over 21% in 2023. Some estimates put the real number closer to 40. China's population has already begun shrinking. Projections suggest it could lose 786 million people by 2100, more than half of its current population. The government's response? Cash bonuses for young brides. Propaganda celebrating motherhood has been widely mocked. The lesson from Asia is sobering. Once these trends take root, even hundreds of billions of dollars in government spending can't reverse them. The crisis is cultural and existential, not just economic. The void left by collapsing social infrastructure has spawned a constellation of movements attempting to make sense of what's happening. Some are productive, some are toxic. Most live in the gray area. On the male side, you have the manosphere pipeline, starting with relatively moderate self-improvement content, then escalating through red pill philosophy into more extreme spaces. The trad mask, or traditional masculinity, movement appeals to young men who feel that modern culture offers them no clear path, no inherent value, and no respect. They're reaching for a set of rules, even rigid ones, because having no rules at all feels worse. On the female side, the 4B movement from South Korea found a surprisingly receptive audience among progressive American Gen Z women on TikTok. Heteropessimism, a general disenchantment with straight relationships, has become a recognizable cultural current. The trad wife aesthetic pulled some women in the other direction, romanticizing domestic life and traditional roles. These aren't fringe movements anymore. They shape how millions of young people think about gender, partnership, and whether the whole project of coupledom is even worth attempting. So what happens next? Nobody has a crystal ball, but the current data supports a few plausible paths. Scenario 1, the drift continues. If nothing changes, if young people keep living with parents longer, if social time keeps declining, if dating apps keep failing, and men and women keep retreating into separate ideological bubbles, the trajectory is clear. Lower marriage rates, lower birth rates, longer stretches of singlehood, economies that can't sustain aging populations, countries fighting over a shrinking pool of workers. We already see this in South Korea, Japan, and China. The question is whether the West follows. Scenario 2, the gender gap becomes a relationship gap. If political sorting intensifies, if young men keep moving right and young women keep moving left, and both keep treating politics as a deal breaker, the dating pool doesn't just shrink, it fractures. You end up with large chunks of each gender who are fundamentally unwilling to partner with the available options. That is not a recipe for a baby boom. Scenario 3, an offline revival. There are early signs, mostly anecdotal, but real, of a counter trend. Young people seeking out in-person social events, running clubs, and hobby groups gaining traction. Dating app fatigue pushing people back toward friend introductions and organic meetups. If institutions, schools, workplaces, community organizations deliberately rebuild social infrastructure, and if dating platforms shift their business models away from addictive engagement and toward actual friendship formation, some of this could stabilize. The World Health Organization has started framing loneliness as a major global health challenge. The Surgeon General's advisory wasn't just symbolic, it was a signal. Scenario 4, technology fills the void. 35% of Gen Z believes AI companions will be common in romantic life by 2050. Virtual intimacy is already a growing market. If human connection keeps getting harder and more expensive and more emotionally dangerous, technology will step in to offer a frictionless substitute. Whether that substitute is fulfilling or whether it just deepens the spiral is one of the defining questions of the coming decades. Here's the thing, every number in this video represents a real person. A guy in his mid-20s who hasn't been on a date in 3 years and doesn't know how to start. A woman who deleted every app because the exhaustion outweighed the hope. A teenager sitting in their bedroom at 11 p.m. scrolling through content about people living lives they're not living. The instinct is to point at one cause. Blame the phones, blame feminism, blame the economy, blame men, blame women, blame the apps. But this isn't a single cause story, it's a system. Economics and delayed adulthood, digital substitution and algorithm-driven dating markets, mental health strain, political and identity sorting, each amplifying the others in feedback loops that nobody designed but everybody's stuck in. The question isn't whether Gen Z is broken, the question is whether the world they inherited gave them a fair shot at the things every generation before them took for granted. Connection, intimacy, partnership, and a future worth building together. Because right now, a lot of them are staring at that future, and they're not sure it's there.